Welcome back to XRP Daily Brief. And before we even warm up, let me hit you with something real. The past few hours have delivered one of the sharpest shifts in narrative we've seen all month. We've got a brand new development out of the White House that directly affects crypto markets, fresh numbers from CME Group that most people are going to misunderstand, and a ridiculous 500 times this year claim that's floating around. Something we're going to tear apart and break down with actual logic instead of daydreams. So lock in, because if you hold XRP, what I'm about to walk you through isn't optional information. This is the stuff that separates people who understand the macro setup from those who fall for noise, clickbait, and fantasy targets pushed by influencers. Let's get into the first hit, the White House update. And no, I'm not here to dramatize it or twist it into some bullish emergency alert like half the crypto influencers do. What dropped is straightforward. The current administration is moving into a policy phase that will directly affect liquidity conditions in the US markets. And in case you forgot, liquidity is the lifeblood of XRP. Without liquidity expansion, nothing moves. I don't care how many press releases you read, how many CEOs tweet, or how many tokenization announcements drop. Without liquidity, price stays pinned. And right now, the White House is playing a role whether they realize it or not, because macro policy decisions impact liquidity providers, the same people who have the final say in how fast capital flows into crypto. But let's shift to the piece that actually matters. CME Group's statement, which would have flown over the heads of 90% of the market if you weren't paying attention. CME Group, the single biggest derivatives exchange in the world. I'll repeat that for the people who like to pretend that random crypto exchanges matter more. Put out numbers that tell a story most of the XRP community still doesn't fully grasp. They said that since launching in May, demand for their regulated XRP futures product has exploded. Their words, not mine. Over 567,000 plus contracts traded, equivalent to nearly 27 billion in volume, representing around 9 billion XRP. Now here's where most people fall into fantasy land. They see big numbers and instantly jump to the price should be pumping. No, that's not how this works. XRP futures do not drive price higher. Futures create market structure, not market direction. They create liquidity conditions, not demand for the actual asset. Futures volume can skyrocket while price does absolutely nothing. And that's exactly what's happening. But here's what CME is really implying. The institutions are warming up. They're turning on the engine. They're testing liquidity depth. They're measuring volatility. They're mapping out how XRP reacts under different volume loads. This is preparation, not price impact. Preparation. Because the real punch comes from spot XRP ETFs, not futures. And this is where the casual viewer gets confused. Futures are noise. ETFs are signal that spot ETFs mean real asset purchases, real supply removal, real demand applying pressure on the actual XRP supply. We're talking Bitwise, CoinShares, WisdomTree, Canary Capital, and yes, eventually the giants like BlackRock, CK, and Grayscale. If you think these players are coming into this space for fun or publicity, you're delusional. These are trillion-dollar firms. They don't experiment, they accumulate. And CME's announcement today is basically telling everyone with half a brain, get ready. The infrastructure is warming up. Liquidity mapping is underway. The institutional runway is being built. Most retail investors won't process any of this because they're too busy staring at short-term price candles and reacting emotionally to Twitter headlines. But people who actually understand market structure know exactly what CME is signaling. But before we unpack the 500x claim and the ETF angle later in the video, there's one more thing you need to understand from this part: the separation between narrative and reality. Right now, the XRP market is split between people chasing hype and people analyzing fundamentals. One group gets wrecked every cycle. The other survives every cycle and profits from long-term structural moves. This CME update is not hype. It's not some secret code. It is a hard data point showing you that institutions are already engaging with XRP derivatives at scale. And you better believe they don't warm up unless they intend to move into the real thing. The next thing that needs to be called out is the absolute circus coming from mainstream crypto media. The moment CME released their numbers, instead of digging into what those numbers actually mean, half the outlets shifted straight into useless distractions. And the worst offender today was Coinbaro. They pushed the headline, "Ripple co-founder cashes out again," like it's some smoking gun. It's embarrassing how predictable these outlets are. They need clicks, not truth. So they grab the most dramatic angle they can find, even if it's completely misleading. Anyone who's been paying attention knows exactly what Chris Larsen did. Yes, he moved XRP, but he also invested heavily into one of the largest XRP treasuries in existence. You don't inject 50 million XRP into a long-term institutional-grade treasury if you're trying to dump and run. That move alone completely destroys the narrative they're trying to push, but they won't tell that part because it doesn't generate outrage. And this is exactly why retail gets blindsided. They trust headlines more than on-chain data or institutional behavior. Meanwhile, what the actual numbers tell us is that despite the noise, the underlying interest from serious players hasn't slowed down at all. The only thing suppressing this market right now isn't sentiment. It's structural pressure. Between the government shutdown drama, tariff conflicts, and liquidity providers playing defensive, you're seeing the exact opposite of a free market. The news itself isn't the problem. The reaction of liquidity providers is they pull back, spreads tighten, volatility gets choked, and price movement flatlines. And today's announcement from the White House only adds more fog. President Trump preparing to meet Jinping next Thursday, and Scott Bessent stepping in to handle the vice presidential level meeting tells you exactly what's going on. Geopolitical tension is high enough to freeze certain flows until clarity arrives. When liquidity providers smell uncertainty, they sit on their hands. That's why the market moves like it's underwater. But here's what most people miss. Once these choke points clear, the rebound is violent. XRP has always behaved like a compressed spring. Long periods of suppression followed by explosive unwinding. And with ETFs closing in, that pressure is building at the exact moment retail attention is pointed in the wrong direction. This is why relying on media narratives is a losing strategy. You can't navigate a market by reading headlines written by people who don't even understand derivatives, order books, or institutional positioning. You have to look at who's buying, who's building, and who's positioning for long-term custody. And right now, every signal from the institution says the same thing. They are preparing for scale. Retail is busy arguing about whether Chris Elson sold tokens. Meanwhile, CME is processing contract volume in the billions. Franklin Templeton is gearing up. BlackRock CK isn't even at the table yet. And still the infrastructure is expanding. That's the real story. That's what actually matters. And if you're not paying attention to that side of the chessboard, you're already behind. The government shutdown has turned into the single biggest drag on this market. And anyone pretending otherwise isn't paying attention. It's not the headlines themselves that are choking price action. It's the liquidity response behind the scenes. When the government enters shutdown mode, every major liquidity provider shifts to a defensive posture. That means tighter risk parameters, slower order execution, reduced exposure, and less willingness to take the other side of large trades. And when liquidity providers pull back, the entire crypto market feels like it's frozen in cement. This is why candles look sluggish. Even when news should be bullish, the system is literally being throttled. And XRP, being a high beta asset with massive upside elasticity, suffers the most because its explosive moves only occur when liquidity expands, not when it's constrained. You can have perfect fundamentals, perfect adoption signals, perfect ETF momentum. None of it matters if the pipes are clogged by macro uncertainty. Add the ongoing tariff and trade war drama to the mix, and you've got even more risk-off behavior every time the US and China start throwing tariff threats at each other. Liquidity providers tighten the valve, not because the news directly affects cryptocurrencies, but because risk models treat uncertainty with maximum caution. This is why people who say the news shouldn't affect crypto don't understand how markets actually work. Price doesn't react to headlines. It reacts to liquidity shifts triggered by those headlines. Meanwhile, the retail crowd keeps blaming market makers, manipulating XRP as if shadowy villains are sitting in a dark control room flipping switches. The reality is much more boring. These firms follow automated models built around volatility, credit exposure, and cross-sector risk. When government operations stall, when trade negotiations spark fear, or when fiscal policy becomes unpredictable, those models automatically restrict liquidity. No conspiracy, it's just math. But here's where things get interesting. When this kind of suppression happens during a period of upcoming catalysts like XRP ETF launches, the eventual breakout becomes exponentially more violent because all that pent-up demand, all that inflow pressure, all that sidelined liquidity eventually has to unwind. And when it does, it doesn't trickle. It erupts. XRP has done this multiple times throughout its history. Long, frustrating stagnation followed by a blast that leaves everyone who wasn't paying attention completely stunned. What makes this moment especially unique is that it's not just retail sitting and waiting. Institutions are circling, preparing, positioning, building infrastructure, and raising exposure. But they're not going to chase price in the middle of macro instability. They wait for structural clarity and the end of the shutdown, stabilization of trade negotiations, consistency in fiscal policy, and then they enter without hesitation. And when they do, they don't buy $1,000 worth of XRP. They buy millions. This is the part most people underestimate. Retail thinks of dips emotionally. Institutions think of dips strategically. They wait for the environment to turn, and when it does, they don't nibble. They reposition entire portfolios. XRP is sitting right in the middle of that transition zone. Once the shutdown ends, once liquidity reopens, and once ETF inflows start showing up in real numbers, the compression disappears almost instantly. And that's when the fireworks begin. Anyone ignoring this phase right now because the chart looks slow is making a huge mistake. This is the setup phase, the boring part right before acceleration. You can see the tension building across the broader crypto space, and pretending it's not happening would be delusional. Bitcoin dominance is slipping, liquidity is rotating, and traders are starting to position themselves like something bigger is on the horizon. But here's where the disconnect kicks in. Most people still treat XRP like it's supposed to behave like a meme coin, as if it should pump every time the crowd gets excited. That mindset is childish. XRP's value doesn't come from hype cycles. It comes from infrastructure level adoption, and infrastructure moves differently. It builds quietly, then it breaks loudly, and we're right in the middle of that quiet buildup. Look at what's happening with the banks. They're not experimenting anymore. They're integrating, they're connecting corridors, replacing outdated rails, and trying to figure out how to move money without the friction that's killing their margins. XRP sits right in that problem space. Whether people like it or not, the entire thesis for XRP has always been utility at scale, not short-term dopamine. And this is exactly why so many retail holders remain confused. They want moonshots every week, but they don't want to understand the mechanics behind those moonshots. The liquidity metrics right now say a lot. Market makers are slowly coming back in, and you don't attract institutional liquidity unless the environment is becoming favorable. No one with real capital steps into a dead ecosystem. They step in when the rails are finally being positioned for real utility. And no, that doesn't mean tomorrow morning you'll wake up to a $50 XRP. That's childish thinking. What it means is that the foundation is strengthening in places retail never looks. Settlement latency metrics, corridor expansion, enterprise pilot progression, liquidity demand across on-chain payment pathways. Most people don't even know these metrics exist, let alone track them. Another thing people are missing, regulatory clarity isn't coming for XRP. It's already here compared to most of the market. You can complain about the SEC all you want, but the fact is XRP has more legal definition now than 90% of the space pretending to be compliant. And clarity equals confidence. Confidence equals capital flow. Capital flow equals price movement. When paired with real volume, not manufactured hype, Most people want to skip these steps. They want the payoff without the patience, and that's exactly how they get blindsided. And let's not ignore the psychological game going on right now. Whales are playing accumulation games while retail panics over every small correction. You can literally see the wallet behavior showing strategic scooping at key support levels. That's not noise, that's intention. Smart money doesn't chase green candles, it stalks red ones. If you're not paying attention to that, you're going to be the person screaming manipulation while someone else is quietly stacking their future profit below your fear threshold. Right now, the market is telling you something very clearly if you're willing to listen. We're in a pre-ompression phase, the kind of structure where the chart doesn't move much, but everything behind the scenes is building pressure. And yes, this is where most people get bored, impatient, or reckless. They make emotional decisions because they mistake silence for failure. Nothing could be further from the truth. The longer a market compresses with strengthening fundamentals, the bigger the eventual breakout, up or down, depending on who controls the narrative at the moment it triggers. XRP is setting up in a way that rewards people who understand cycles, not feelings. So if you're still reacting to every little dip or tweet, you're not thinking seriously about this asset. You're trading your emotions, not the market. This phase is about positioning, observation, and discipline, not fantasy price targets or blind optimism. This is where smart investors prepare while everyone else distracts themselves with noise. Here's where things get real, because this is the part most people avoid. The uncomfortable truth about what's holding XRP back and what's slowly turning in its favor. If you think the price is suppressed purely because market makers hate XRP, you're oversimplifying the situation to a childish degree. The truth is harsher. XRP's liquidity has been bottlenecked for years by infrastructure gaps, inconsistent institutional participation, and uncertainty around global regulations. That combination created a perfect storm that kept the asset from moving the way its supporters expected. You can hate that reality, but denying it won't change anything. But here's the flip side. That storm is clearing slowly, but undeniably. And if you're not seeing that shift, you're either not paying attention or you're stuck in an echo chamber of hopium where everything is guaranteed to moon. That mindset will get you wrecked. Look at the corridors being reactivated, the partnerships resurfacing, the payment pilots scaling. You don't get that kind of movement unless companies see real cost savings and consistent reliability. These aren't retail promises. These are enterprise decisions being made by people with zero interest in hype. And let's talk about something that nobody on crypto Twitter wants to address. Price suppression isn't some Illuminati conspiracy. It's simply what happens when utility hasn't fully materialized yet. Markets reward realized value, not theoretical potential. XRP has always had potential, but potential doesn't pay the bills. Real usage does. And we're finally watching the early stages of that usage breakthrough. That doesn't mean an overnight explosion. It means a slow, grinding shift in how money moves. And that shift gets reflected in price after liquidity demand scales, not before. Now, here's another thing you need to understand. The ETF narrative is distracting people from the real prize. ETFs are temporary hype. Utility is permanent. XRP doesn't need an ETF. It needs volume. And not speculative volume, but operational volume, settlement volume, cross-border volume. If that clicks, the price doesn't just rise. It re-rates entirely. That's the difference between a speculative asset and an infrastructure asset. One pumps, the other reprices. And yes, this is where people get wrecked by their own expectations. They look at shorter-term coins pumping and start questioning their XRP position, as if the entire global payment system is supposed to overhaul itself on their personal timeline. That's delusion. This isn't some meme project that jumps 5 times because of a tweet. This is infrastructure adoption by financial institutions, and that naturally moves slower until it suddenly doesn't. That sudden moment is what everyone tries to catch, but they ignore the boring buildup that creates it. Right now, the boring phase is almost over. You can see it in on-chain flows. You can see it in liquidity patterns. You can see it in how market makers are positioning. There's less volatility, not because XRP is dead, but because the market is stabilizing ahead of a structural shift. Lower volatility plus stronger fundamentals is exactly what precedes large directional moves. If you've seen enough market cycles, you recognize the pacing instantly. If you haven't, you mistake it for stagnation. This next phase won't be about predicting a magical price target. It'll be about recognizing how the flow of value is changing. And if you're stuck in the mindset of XRP should already be $50, you're mentally unprepared for how real value unlocks. The people who make money in moments like these are the ones who detach from emotion and look at data. Everyone else, they react late and blame the market. Here's where everything comes together. Not in some fantasy land prediction, not in the blindopium people throw around, but in the actual data-backed reality of what XRP can and cannot do this year. If you came here expecting me to say it's shooting straight to $100 by December, you're in the wrong place. That's not how real markets work, and anyone feeding you that nonsense is either clueless or deliberately manipulating engagement. You want truth, then you need to accept that XRP's breakout potential is tied to conditions that are finally shifting but haven't fully locked in yet. Let's start with the number everyone keeps obsessing over, that 500x claim. Stop treating predictions like gospel. Not a single credible institution, liquidity provider, or real analyst believes a 500x move is possible within months, without a catastrophic breakdown of the entire global monetary system. You don't get a 500x in a regulated asset unless the underlying market structure completely transforms. Could XRP see explosive growth once full-scale implementation happens? Yes, but the timeline influencers keep peddling as nonsense, a realistic take. XRP's price ceiling this year is driven by three things: regulatory alignment, corridor activation, and institutional liquidity. Not Twitter threads, not YouTube hype, not random predictions. The regulatory clarity phase is mostly done, but not globally synchronized. Corridor activations are happening, but not at max throughput. Institutional liquidity is returning, but in stages, not all at once. Those three conditions need to converge before any face-melting rally can even begin. Now here's the part that most people skip because it's not sexy enough. The biggest catalyst for XRP is stability, not chaos. The market wants predictable settlement solutions, not volatile speculation. Every time XRP stabilizes for long periods, retail panics. Meanwhile, institutions see a dependable settlement tool. That's how infrastructure assets behave before they re-rate. Bitcoin doesn't behave like that. Meme coins don't behave like that. XRP does because it's designed for utility, not hype cycles. You want the truth? XRP has a legitimate shot to reclaim its old highs and push beyond them once liquidity deepens, corridors expand, and market makers commit. This isn't. It's the same pattern every utility asset follows before breaking out. But expecting triple-digit targets this year is you trying to skip the entire adoption curve. The people screaming XRP to 1,000 now don't understand macroeconomics, liquidity flows, or settlement demand. They just want clicks. If you stay grounded, you'll see the real angle here. XRP doesn't need speculative mania to win. It needs volume. And volume is coming back slowly, quietly, and under the radar. That's why long-term holders aren't panicked. They understand that real value comes from actual utility, not social media noise. The impatient crowd won't make it to the finish line. The strategic ones will. Let's wrap with the only responsible thing to say here. Because no matter how much research you do, no matter how strongly you believe in XRP's future, this market is unpredictable. You're responsible for your own decisions. This is not financial advice. Do your own research, verify everything, and never take anyone's word of including mine as a guarantee.